Welcome back to the Qualified Expert series from Subthesis. The standing reminder before we start. This course is education about the expert determination pathway, not a certification, and nothing here is legal advice. Today is the single most important video in Module 1 because we read the rule that defines the profession, and we read it the way a lawyer reads a statute, one phrase at a time. This is a long session, about 40 minutes, and it is dense on purpose. Every phrase we unpack will come back in a client conversation, a report, or an audit. Subscribe if you have not already, and the full course roadmap is at subthesis.com. Your entire future profession fits inside one regulatory sentence. That is not an exaggeration. Everything a qualified expert is, does, and signs comes from 45 CFR section 164.514b1, a provision short enough to read aloud in under a minute, but every word in it is load-bearing. A person with appropriate knowledge and experience, generally accepted statistical and scientific principles and methods, determines that the risk is very small, alone or in combination with other reasonably available information, by an anticipated recipient, to identify an individual who is a subject of the information, and documents the methods and results. Each of those phrases carries a career's worth of meaning, and regulators, clients, and opposing counsel will hold your work against them. So today we do what lawyers do with statutes and what you should do with any rule you plan to build a practice on. We read it slowly, phrase by phrase. We look at who actually makes the determination and who merely renders an opinion. We look at what the guidance says generally accepted actually names. We spend real time on a genuine legal tension around derived codes that most courses get flatly wrong. We look at what the enforcement record does and does not tell you, and we finish with an audit you can run on any determination, including your own. 5 objectives today. First, you will hear and see the full text of section 164.514b1, verbatim, because paraphrases lose exactly the nuances that matter. Second, you will be able to unpack every load-bearing phrase in it, the qualification clause, the generally accepted clause, the very small risk clause, the reasonably available information clause, the anticipated recipient clause, the subject of the information clause, and the documentation clause. Third, you will be able to explain the two-actor structure hiding in the opening words, because the covered entity determines and the expert renders the opinion, and the word only if does real legal work. Fourth, you will be able to analyze a derived re-identification code correctly, which means understanding the prohibition in section 164.514c, the latitude the guidance gives an expert, and the honest tension between the two, a tension that most training materials flatten into a rule that is simply wrong. And fifth, you will be able to audit any determination, including your own, against the 4 phrases of the rule, and name the failure signature of each. Let us read the text. Here is the rule, exactly as codified. A covered entity may determine that health information is not individually identifiable health information only if 1. A person with appropriate knowledge of and experience with generally accepted statistical and scientific principles and methods for rendering information not individually identifiable, applying such principles and methods, determines that the risk is very small that the information could be used alone or in combination with other reasonably available information by an anticipated recipient to identify an individual who is a subject of the information, and documents the methods and results of the analysis that justify such determination. That is the whole thing. Read it again in your head and notice its architecture, because the architecture is what you will be examined on. The provision names a kind of person. It requires that person to apply a particular class of methods. It assigns that person a specific analytical act, determining that a defined quantity is very small. It defines the quantity contextually, in combination with outside information, in the hands of a specific recipient, against a specific class of human beings. And it closes with a mandatory duty to write it all down. 1 sentence, 7 phrases, 4 pillars. Everything else in this course is elaboration. When a regulator, an auditor, or an opposing lawyer examines your work, they will walk these exact words in this exact order, so that is the order we walk them today. Notice one structural detail already. The 2 subparts are joined by the word and, not or. Analysis alone does not satisfy the rule, and documentation alone certainly does not. You need both, and we will return to that. The qualification clause names no degree, no license, no certification, and no government registry. That silence is deliberate. During rulemaking, commenters asked HHS to name a credential, and the department declined, reasoning that statistical disclosure limitation is an interdisciplinary field drawing on mathematics, computer science, epidemiology, and economics, with no single licensing board that owns it. Video 4 takes that finding apart in full, including OCR's exact words, so today I want you focused on the grammar instead, because the grammar is where the requirement actually lives. Read it slowly. Knowledge of and experience with generally accepted statistical and scientific principles and methods. That is 2 distinct requirements joined by and. Knowledge without experience is a graduate seminar. Experience without knowledge is somebody who has run a masking script 40 times and cannot tell you what it protects against. The rule wants both, and a reviewer can probe either one. Notice also what both requirements attach to. Not de-identification generally, not privacy. Specifically, generally accepted statistical and scientific principles and methods for rendering information not individually identifiable. That last clause narrows the field considerably. A brilliant machine learning engineer with no disclosure control background does not satisfy this phrase merely by being brilliant. And because there is no credential to check in advance, the test is applied in reverse, after the fact, by an agency looking at your training and your track record with the benefit of hindsight and a bad outcome in front of them. That is the professional reality this course keeps returning to. You are not qualified because someone stamped you. You are qualified because your training, your track record, and your methodology would survive hostile review. Module 6 turns that into a concrete plan. Now the second half of the qualification clause, and it is the half people skate past. Generally accepted statistical and scientific principles and methods. That phrase is not decorative. It is a fence. It excludes improvised techniques, and it means an expert who invents a bespoke masking scheme carries a burden that an expert applying a standard technique does not. So what is inside the fence? The guidance describes generally accepted principles as established disclosure limitation techniques used within the scientific community to mask original values and mitigate privacy risk. Supporting HHS technical documentation and testimony in the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics records name the shortlist directly. The addition of statistical noise, which blurs data by adjusting case values while preserving the overall distribution. Data swapping, which exchanges sensitive characteristics between individuals within the same sample to create pseudo-cases. Controlled rounding. Suppression, the outright removal of values or records. Generalization, the coarsening of granular values into broader categories, and increasingly, synthetic data generation, which substitutes artificial records that mirror the statistical properties of the original data without corresponding to any real person. 6 named families. Module 3 teaches you to actually operate them, and this is not an exhaustive list because the field moves. But hold on to the practical implication. When you write a report, naming your technique in this vocabulary is worth real money to you, because a reviewer who recognizes the name of your method spends their scrutiny on your parameters rather than on your legitimacy. If you use something newer, differential privacy mechanisms for instance, you must situate it in the literature explicitly, cite it, and explain why the community accepts it. Novelty is allowed. Unexplained novelty is a vulnerability. There's a sentence buried in the interpretive material that functions as an operational competency test, and I want you to memorize its shape. Read against the guidance and the supporting record. An individual qualifies as an expert under this provision only if they possess the mathematical capability to apply these techniques and to compute the expected uniqueness of records within a target population. Read that twice. It is 2 capabilities joined by and, exactly like the knowledge and experience pairing, and the second one is the one that separates practitioners from operators. Applying the techniques is the part software helps with. Anyone can run a generalization routine or a suppression pass. Plenty of commercial tools will do it for you and print a certificate. But computing the expected uniqueness of records within a target population is a genuinely statistical act. Notice the phrase target population, not sample. Your dataset is a sample. The population is the group of real human beings out in the world from which your records were drawn. And the number that matters for an adversary is how many of those people share a records combination of values, not how many rows in your file share it. Estimating that requires you to reason about sampling fractions, to select an estimator, and to defend it, which is exactly the machinery modules 3 and 4 build. This one sentence is why a de-identification vendor's software output is not by itself an expert determination. Software computes sample uniqueness readily. Population uniqueness must be estimated, and estimation requires a person who understands what the estimator assumes and when it breaks. When you interview a candidate expert, or when you assess yourself, this is the question to ask. Not what tools do you run? Ask, how do you estimate population uniqueness, and what happens to your estimate when the sampling fraction changes? Phrase 3, and the shortest one carries the heaviest freight, determines that the risk is very small. 2 things about it, and they pull in opposite directions. First, very small is deliberately not 0. The guidance says so directly. Both methods, even when properly applied, yield de-identified data that retains some risk of identification. And although the risk is very small, it is not 0. 0 risk is achievable only by destroying the data's analytic value entirely, and a rule demanding 0 would have made the whole pathway pointless. So the regulation tolerates a small, justified residual risk, and that tolerance is the reason the profession exists. Second, and this is what frustrates newcomers, no regulation and no guidance ever assigns very small a number. The guidance states plainly that there is no explicit level of identification risk that is deemed to universally meet the very small level indicated by the method. The original preamble used the phrase very low probability interchangeably with very small, and likewise refused to quantify it. This was a design choice, not an oversight. A number frozen into the Federal Register in the year 2000 would now be 26 years stale against modern computing power, modern data brokerage, and modern linkage techniques, and it would be simultaneously too strict for a locked enclave and recklessly loose for a public download. By delegating the threshold, the rule keeps the standard moving with the science. The consequence for you is uncomfortable but clarifying. There is no number you can point to and no authority you can hide behind. You choose the threshold, you justify it in writing against published precedent, and you own it. Video 5 explores how the guidance fills that gap with principles instead of numbers, and Module 4 is devoted entirely to choosing and defending the number itself. Phrase 4 is the mosaic clause, and it is the phrase that turns this job from data cleaning into threat modeling. The risk is not that the information identifies someone on its own. It is the risk that the information could be used, alone or in combination with other reasonably available information, to identify someone. Alone or in combination. Your dataset is never assessed in isolation. It is assessed as one tile in a mosaic that includes voter registration files, birth and death and marriage records, property records, commercial data broker products, news coverage, social media, and breach dumps. Now the word that does the limiting. Reasonably available. That word is a mercy and a trap at the same time. It is a mercy because you are not required to defend against an omniscient adversary. It is a trap because reasonably is undefined, and the temptation is to define it as whatever is convenient for the release you want to approve. Here is a subtlety worth noticing, because careful readers catch it, and it is a good question to be ready for. The regulation says reasonably available. The 2012 guidance, when it discusses this same idea, repeatedly asks which external data sources are readily available to the anticipated recipient. Reasonably and readily are not the same word. Readily leans toward practical accessibility, what this recipient can actually get their hands on without unusual effort. Reasonably leans toward objective foreseeability. In practice, the two converge on the same discipline, and that discipline is inventory. Do not write the phrase reasonably available information in your report as a conclusion. Write it as a list. Name the sources, state what variables each one carries, state what it costs and who may obtain it, and then say which ones you modeled and which you excluded and why. A named, priced, sourced inventory is defensible. An adjective is not. Phrase 5 names whose hands the data lands in, and it is the phrase that most often gets an otherwise competent determination overturned in practice. The risk is that the information could be used by an anticipated recipient, not by anyone, not in principle, by a specific, identified recipient whose resources, motives, and existing knowledge you have actually assessed. This makes every determination relative to a data environment. The guidance's own worked example is voter registration files, which in some states cheaply supply name, birth date, sex, and zip code for linkage, and in other states are restricted or prohibitively expensive. Identical data in two different states can carry genuinely different risk, and the guidance says so explicitly. The recipient's own position matters just as much as their state. A recipient who is an employee of the covered entity and who might have family members or neighbors in the dataset brings a knowledge base no outsider has, and the guidance flags exactly that scenario. And at the far end of the spectrum sits public release, when the anticipated recipient is the world, because the file will be posted for download. You have surrendered every environmental control at once, and you must assume maximum auxiliary data availability and maximum computational capability. So here is the operational rule, and it is the single most practically useful sentence in this video. Change the recipient and you have changed the determination. An opinion written for a lockdown research enclave does not stretch to cover a public posting, not ever, no matter how good the math was. If your client asks whether they can also publish the file that you cleared for their research partner, the answer is that you need a new analysis, and often a differently transformed dataset. Video 5 shows that the guidance expressly permits deriving several differently protected releases from one source, each justified on its own. Phrase 6 looks like boilerplate and is not. To identify an individual who is a subject of the information, ask the obvious question: who counts as a subject? The instinctive answer is the patient, and the instinctive answer is incomplete. Look at the neighboring safe harbor provision for the drafter's own view of scope. It requires removing identifiers of the individual or of relatives, employers, or household members of the individual. The drafters plainly contemplated that a health record carries information about people other than the patient, and expert determination inherits that concern even though its own text is shorter. Consider what is actually in a clinical record. A family history field states that the patient's mother died of breast cancer at 41. That is identifiable information about the mother, a person who is not your client's patient. A social history field notes the patient lives with a partner who has active tuberculosis. That is a diagnosis about a household member. An address is shared by everyone living at that address. Then look at the unstructured text, where free-form progress notes routinely name the referring physician, the surgeon, the interpreter, and the case manager. Those are identifiable individuals too, and while they are not patients, a note that names a rare subspecialist and a procedure date can be a powerful linkage key back to the patient. So when you scope a determination, ask explicitly who the subjects are in this dataset, plural, and write the answer down. In structured tabular data, the answer is usually just the patient's, and you can say so in a sentence. In records with family history, household composition, or free text narrative, the answer is broader, and a reviewer who notices that you never asked the question has found a gap. This is also where the notorious hardness of unstructured text enters the profession, and Video 14 returns to it. Go back to the words that open the whole implementation specification, the ones people read past because they sound like throat clearing. A covered entity may determine that health information is not individually identifiable health information only if two things are happening in that fragment and both matter to you commercially. First, the two-actor structure. The grammatical subject of the verb determine is the covered entity, not you. The covered entity is the party that legally determines that its data is de-identified. Your role, defined by the subordinate clause, is to be the person whose analysis and documentation make that determination lawful. In practice, you render an opinion and the client acts on it. This is why your deliverable is properly framed as a determination report and an attestation rather than a certificate, and Video 13 builds that document. It is also why the regulatory liability for a failed determination sits primarily with the covered entity, which is exactly why sophisticated clients scrutinize your credentials so hard. They are borrowing your judgment and keeping the risk. Second, the phrase, only if. In regulatory drafting, only if signals exclusivity and necessity. It means these two implementation specifications, expert determination and safe harbor, are the complete set of ways to reach de-identified status, and there is no third path. Not a strong internal policy, not an institutional review board approval, not a data use agreement, however strict, not a vendor's marketing claim that its output is anonymized. If neither pathway was properly executed, the data is still protected health information, and every use and disclosure restriction still applies. You will meet clients who believe their pipeline produces de-identified data because a tool told them so. Reading them this fragment of the rule, slowly, is often the entire consulting engagement's first hour, and it is the hour that earns the rest. Phrase 7 converts your analysis into a legal artifact, and it is the phrase that decides whether the work you did counts. Subpart 2 says the expert documents the methods and results of the analysis that justify such determination. Look at the structure of the provision once more. Subpart 1, the analysis. Subpart 2, the documentation. Joined by and. Run a flawless analysis and skip the write-up, and the data legally remains protected health information, because the paragraph has 2 subparts and you satisfied exactly one. Say that to a client who tells you their data scientist did the math last year but never wrote anything down. Legally, nothing happened. Now notice both nouns, because they are different obligations. Methods means what you did, the adversary assumptions you adopted, the population you compared against, the transformations you applied and their exact parameters, the estimator you selected, the threshold you set and the precedent you set it against. Results means what the numbers actually showed, not a conclusion that risk is low, the computed values, the class size distribution behind them, and the reasoning that connects those values to the phrase very small for this specific recipient. A reviewer reads methods to decide whether to trust you, and reads results to decide whether you are right. The retention duty attaches to the covered entity, which must keep the documentation for 6 years from creation or from the date it was last in effect, whichever is later, under Section 164.530J, and must produce it in a compliance review. Video 5 works through that clock in detail. For now, burn in the principle that governs everything you will ever be paid for in this field. In this profession, undocumented work does not exist. Your report is the shield, for the client and for you. The rule says document the methods and results, and stops. The guidance is more specific, and its specification is a 3-part chronicle that maps directly onto the workflow it describes. Part 1. The initial evaluation of recipient capacity. Before any transformation, you assessed who is receiving this data and what they can do with it, and that assessment goes in writing first, because everything downstream depends on it. Part 2. The specific statistical mitigation methods executed. Named techniques with their actual parameters. Not we generalize geography, but 5-digit zip codes were rolled to 3-digit zip codes, and the following 3-digit prefixes covering fewer than 20,000 people were suppressed. Not we removed outliers, but cell suppression was applied to records in classes below the following size, affecting this many records, being this percentage of the file. Part 3. The final mathematical evaluation, proving the risk is no more than very small. The numbers, after mitigation, against the threshold you declared for the recipient you named. 3 parts. Notice what that structure implies about form. The guidance describes determination as an iterative process, so the document is a chronicle of a loop, not a certificate of an outcome. A report that presents only a final passing number has hidden the most interesting part of the work, which is the sequence of measurements that forced each transformation. A reviewer wants to see the baseline risk, the intervention, the remeasured risk, and the next intervention. That trail is what demonstrates that your conclusion was derived rather than assumed. One practical consequence. Because the guidance expects the chronicle, keep the intermediate numbers as you work. Practitioners who compute in a notebook and then write prose from memory lose the baseline figures, and reconstructing them months later for an audit is miserable. Video 13 builds the full report anatomy on top of this three-part spine. The guidance illustrates expert determination with a figure that is worth describing precisely, because its shape corrects a common misunderstanding of the job. It is not a pipeline with an arrow at the end. It is a cycle. The expert works with the covered entity to analyze the data, determines the methods needed to mitigate identification risk, mathematically assesses the results of those interventions, and loops back, producing documentation as the process converges. Risk assessment and mitigation are interconnected loops rather than a single linear step. Now the part that surprises new practitioners. The guidance frames this as requiring ongoing collaboration between the expert and the covered entity's data managers, who are responsible for the structural design of the information systems. Read that carefully, because it defines your working relationship. You do not own the pipeline. You almost never can transform the data yourself inside the client's production systems, and you should not want to. The people who know that the admission date field is populated by a legacy interface that sometimes writes the discharge date instead, or that a supposedly free text field is actually a constrained drop-down with 9 values, are the client's data managers. Their knowledge changes your risk analysis materially, and their engineering is what implements your mitigation. 2 practical consequences follow. First, scope your engagements to include access to those people, in the engagement letter, by role, because an expert who is handed an extract and no humans is being set up to certify something they do not understand. Second, remember that to perform the analysis, you generally need the raw, unredacted data, which means the covered entity must have a business associate agreement with you before anything moves. That is not optional, and it is not paperwork you can defer. Video 12 runs a full engagement on this structure. One neighboring provision completes the legal picture, and you will use it constantly, so we read it verbatim too. Section 164.514C, Re-identification Codes. Longitudinal research, clinical trials, and public health surveillance all need the ability to link records back to source data later, so the rule permits the covered entity to assign a code for exactly that purpose, under 2 conditions. The derivation condition. The code is not derived from or related to information about the individual, and is not otherwise capable of being translated so as to identify the individual. And the security condition. The covered entity does not use or disclose the code for any other purpose, and does not disclose the mechanism for re-identification. 2 conditions, both mandatory. Note how much work the security condition does on its own. Even a perfectly random code becomes a problem if the covered entity also uses it as an accession number in a lab system that outsiders can query, because then the code is a bridge. And the mechanism, meaning the mapping table or the key, must never leave the covered entity. Now the elegant structural detail. The 18th safe harbor category requires removing any other unique identifying number, characteristic, or code, and a re-identification code is by definition a unique identifying code, so the 2 provisions would collide. The drafters saw it, and paragraph R includes the words, except as permitted by paragraph C of this section. That carve-out makes a properly constructed re-identification code the only unique identifier legally permitted to remain attached to safe harbor de-identified data. That is worth knowing cold, because it is a common client question, and the answer sounds surprising until you can cite the carve-out. The next 2 slides handle the part that is genuinely contested. That is HHS speaking directly in the August 2002 Privacy Rule modifications at 67 FR 53182, answering a commenter who asked whether their dummy identifier scheme was compliant. Read the operative sentence again. The dummy identifier cannot be derived from the individual's social security number, birth date, or hospital record number. 3 examples, and I want you to look hard at the middle one. Social security number and hospital record number are unsurprising. They are direct identifiers, so of course you cannot build your code out of them. But birth date is in that list too, and birth date is not a direct identifier. It is a quasi-identifier. Its presence tells you how broadly the department reads the phrase derived from or related to information about the individual. It is not limited to unique keys. It reaches ordinary demographic attributes. That has an immediate practical consequence in the field, because you will encounter schemes that build a patient code out of initials plus birth date plus sex, or a checksum over the birth date, or a study identifier whose first 4 characters encode the birth year. Those are common in older research infrastructure and in registries built by clinicians rather than by engineers, and they are squarely inside what this passage forbids. Note the phrase that opens the answer as well. So long as the covered entity does not generate the dummy identifier using any individually identifiable information. Using, not encoding recoverably. The department's framing is about the inputs to the generation process, not only about whether the output can be reversed. Hold that distinction, because it is exactly the point where this passage meets the 2012 guidance, and that meeting is genuinely contested. That is the next slide, and it is the most important 5 minutes in this video. Here is where much training material states a rule that is simply too strong, so let us get this exactly right. On the safe harbor side, the position is hard. Section 164.514C says the code is not derived from or related to information about the individual, and the 2002 modification we just read applies that to Social Security number, birth date, and hospital record number. The OCR guidance adds its own example, that a code derived from a secure hash function without a secret key would be considered an identifying element. Without a secret key. The qualifier is doing real work there. The department is describing an unsalted hash, which is genuinely reversible by dictionary attack across a small input space. That is a narrower statement than a blanket claim that any derivation is forbidden. Now the expert determination side. Section 2.9 of the guidance asks directly whether an expert can determine that a code derived from protected health information is de-identified, and the answer is yes, on exactly 2 conditions. First, an expert determines that the data, derived code included, meets the very small risk standard of Section 164.514b1. Second, the keys associated with the derivation, the salt or the secret, are never disclosed to anyone, including the recipients of the de-identified data. In practice, a competent analysis of a derivation mechanism, a hashed medical record number for instance, earns that conclusion by testing the mechanism against real threat vectors, dictionary attacks and rainbow tables among them, and showing it cannot be reverse engineered. So the honest summary is a tension, not a rule. Paragraph C is a bright line that a derived code fails on the safe harbor side. Expert determination gives you latitude that safe harbor does not, and modern cryptographers largely disagree with the strict reading, arguing that a properly salted hash is definitively severed from its input. Carry this practical rule into client work. A genuinely random code, mapped through a protected internal lookup table, is always safe and needs no argument from you. Anything derived requires your documented analysis, and you own it. Now, a question every client eventually asks, and one you should answer carefully rather than reassuringly. Has OCR ever brought an enforcement action against a covered entity because an expert determination turned out to be wrong. On the public record, no. An exhaustive review of resolution agreements, civil monetary penalties, corrective action plans, and audit findings turns up no public action taken against a covered entity solely because a good faith expert determination was later found mathematically flawed, or because de-identified data was subsequently re-identified by a third party. The agency's posture in this area has been education and technical assistance rather than punishment. Its signature initiative here was not a penalty. It was a series of stakeholder workshops in March of 2010 that produced the 2012 guidance. What does that imply? The most defensible reading is that the regime is built on structural integrity. If a covered entity engages a person with appropriate knowledge, and that person applies a recognized methodology and documents a conclusion of very small risk, the implementation specification is satisfied at the moment of creation. Later advances in attack technique do not retroactively make a competent, documented determination unlawful. That is a genuinely reassuring principle for practitioners, and it is why your report functions as a shield. Now the caveat, and please deliver it to clients in exactly this order. Absence of enforcement is not a safe harbor. It is an absence of evidence about a pathway that relatively few entities use in an area the agency has historically deprioritized against breaches and access complaints. It says nothing about class action litigation, state attorneys general, contractual liability to a data recipient, the California Consumer Privacy Act, the General Data Protection Regulation, or reputational catastrophe following a public re-identification demonstration. The exposure is real, and most of it sits outside HIPAA enforcement entirely. Video 13 covers liability properly. Let us convert 40 minutes of text into an audit you can run on any determination, including your own. One test per phrase, and each has a distinct failure signature you can learn to spot. Test 1. The qualification phrase. Ask whether the file evidences both knowledge and experience for the named expert, with a curriculum vitae, prior determinations, and specific de-identification methodology experience, not general privacy work and not general statistics. Failure signature. A report with no expert biography at all, or a biography that lists impressive credentials but never mentions applying disclosure control to health data. Test 2. The methods phrase. Ask whether the techniques are named in generally accepted vocabulary: suppression, generalization, noise addition, swapping, controlled rounding, synthetic generation, and whether anything novel is situated in the literature with citations. Failure signature. Prose that describes the outcome without ever naming the technique. Sentences like, "The data was anonymized using proprietary methods." That is not a method, it is a refusal. Test 3. The risk phrase. Ask whether risk was actually computed rather than asserted, whether a threshold is stated and justified against published precedent, whether the anticipated recipient is named, and whether the reasonably available information is inventoried by source. Failure signature. The phrase, "risk is very small," appearing as a conclusion with no number anywhere in the document, and a recipient described only as researchers. Test 4. The documentation phrase. Ask whether both nouns are present. Methods, in reproducible parameter level detail, and results, as figures with the class distribution behind them. Failure signature. A 2-page attestation letter with no technical report behind it. The letter itself is fine, and it is the right artifact to circulate, but it must sit on top of a real document. 4 tests, run in order. Most weak determinations fail at test 3, and almost every failure at test 3 is visible from the absence of a single number. 3 takeaways from a long session. First, the rule is not a sentence. It is 7 testable requirements stacked inside one sentence, and you now hold a test for each. Knowledge and experience, both. Generally accepted methods, name from a real shortlist that includes noise addition, data swapping, controlled rounding, suppression, generalization, and synthetic data generation. Very small risk, never zero, never numbered by the regulator, always chosen and defended by you. Reasonably available information, inventoried by name rather than asserted by adjective. An anticipated recipient, specific, and if the recipient changes, the determination is void. A subject of the information, which reaches relatives, household members, and named providers, not only patients. And documentation, meaning methods and results, both nouns, written as a chronicle of the loop. Second, the 2-actor structure. The covered entity determines. You render the opinion that makes the determination lawful, and the words "only if" mean there is no third pathway, whatever a policy or a vendor claims. Third, the derived code question, stated honestly. A random code through a protected lookup table is always safe. A derived code fails paragraph C on the safe harbor side, and the 2002 modification puts birth date on the forbidden input list, but section 2.9 of the guidance genuinely permits an expert to analyze a derivation mechanism and conclude that it is adequately de-identified. Latitude exists on the expert side. It costs you a written analysis, and you own that analysis. Next, Module 2, and the guidance that fills in what the rule left blank. Module 2 opens next, where the OCR guidance answers the question everyone asks first: who exactly counts as an expert? And then hands you the 3 principles it gave us instead of a number. Subscribe so it reaches you, and find the full roadmap at subthesis.com.